Laura Nelson thought she had the perfect life, a steady husband, Daniel, and a younger sister, Emily. She loved enough to welcome into her home. But what began as an act of kindness twisted into a nightmare she never saw coming. By the time Laura uncovered the truth that Daniel and Emily were bound by a secret that would shatter her world, it was far too late to turn back. This is the story of a marriage destroyed, a family torn apart, and a betrayal deeper than anyone could imagine. Laura Nelson's life looked as if it had been carefully stitched together from the pages of a magazine. She had a stable job as a teacher, a neat little house in a quiet neighborhood, and a husband who seemed devoted to her. When people spoke about the Nelsons, they used words like solid, steady, and perfect. But perfection often hides cracks so fine that only time and pressure can expose them. It was during one of those moments of compassion that Laura made a choice she would later regret. Her younger sister, Emily, was struggling. Emily had lost her job and was bouncing between temporary places, her savings nearly gone. Laura didn't think twice before offering the spare room in her home. To her, it felt natural. Sisters were meant to lean on one another, and she believed family should come first. Daniel agreed with a polite smile, though Laura later wondered if the way his eyes lingered on Emily had been a warning she missed. At first, the arrangement seemed harmless. Emily helped with groceries, cooked occasionally, and made the house livelier. She laughed easily, wore bright clothes, and filled the space with a carefree energy that contrasted with Laura's more structured lifestyle. Laura felt proud to provide for her, telling herself it was only temporary until Emily got back on her feet. The neighbors saw the three of them together and often commented on how lucky Laura was to have such a close family bond. But as the weeks turned into months, the balance inside the house began to shift. Emily and Daniel often crossed paths while Laura stayed late at school preparing lessons. It started with casual chats in the kitchen, voices carrying softly through the hall. Laura noticed the sound sometimes as she walked through the front door, the conversation cutting short when she entered. She brushed it off as her imagination, unwilling to believe anything unusual was happening. The first sign was small, almost laughable. Laura found a sweater draped over the back of the couch one evening. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't the kind Emily usually wore outside. She thought maybe her sister had left it there after lounging, but the faint smell of Daniel's cologne clung to it. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Then came the coffee cup, half-filled and still warm, even though Laura hadn't made one. She shrugged, assuming Daniel had forgotten it before leaving for work. These were fragments too random to piece together into anything meaningful at the time. Daniel's behavior began to change in ways that were harder to ignore. He locked his phone when he never used to, keeping it face down on the table. When Laura asked about his day, his answers became shorter, as if he was rushing to end the conversation. She reminded herself that people go through phases, that work stress can make anyone distant. She held on to that belief because the alternative was too painful to consider. Emily, meanwhile, seemed restless. She claimed to be applying for jobs, but Laura rarely saw her leave the house for interviews. Instead, Emily spent hours in her room, the glow of her phone lighting her face late at night. When Laura knocked to check in, she was met with quick replies and the sound of hurried movement. Still, Laura clung to the idea that her sister was simply adjusting to her situation, embarrassed about her lack of progress. There was also the photograph. Laura stumbled upon it one afternoon when she borrowed Daniel's phone to make a call. She hadn't meant to snoop, but as the screen lit up, an image caught her eye. It was blurry, but unmistakably Emily's reflection in a mirror, her face turned just enough to reveal her smile. Daniel claimed it had been an accident, just something silly that didn't mean anything. Laura wanted desperately to believe him, so she tucked the unease into a dark corner of her mind. Time dulled her suspicions, but not completely. The small moments, locked doors, hushed tones and glances that lingered a beat too long settled like dust in the corners of her thoughts. She wanted to preserve the fragile picture of happiness she had built. To confront what she feared would mean tearing it all apart, and so she chose silence. What Laura didn't realize was that the truth had already begun to grow roots inside her home. Choices made in shadows were inching toward the light, and her attempts to look away would not stop what was coming. The cracks in her perfect life were widening, and before long they would split open, revealing everything she wasn't ready to see. Daniel's distance grew in ways that Laura could no longer explain away. At first it was subtle. Late nights at the office, quiet dinners where his eyes seemed fixed on something beyond her, phone calls he took in the garage with the door closed. He said tax season was the busiest time of year and she believed him, or at least tried to, but the excuses stacked up too neatly, rehearsed like lines in a play, and soon they began to feel less like reasons and more like barriers meant to keep her from asking too many questions. Emily's behavior shifted as well. The sister who once filled the house with chatter now stayed behind closed doors, her music low, her footsteps soft. When she did come out, she avoided Laura's eyes, ending to be busy with chores or errands. She claimed she had interviews lined up, that she was networking and rebuilding her life, but Laura never saw evidence of it. Instead, Emily bought new clothes, shoes Laura knew she couldn't afford, and began stepping out at odd hours of the evening. Laura wondered if her sister had found someone new but kept quiet out of respect for her privacy. Money began to slip away unnoticed at first, then in amounts too large to ignore. Laura balanced the checkbook and saw withdrawals she hadn't made, charges she didn't recognize, small but consistent. When she asked Angel about them, he gave vague answers about office supplies or client dinners. He spoke with such confidence that she almost believed him, but unease crawled in her stomach each time. For years she had trusted him with their finances, never doubting his honesty. Now she caught herself studying receipts, searching his pockets, wondering what else he might be hiding. The house itself began to feel different, like a stage where every corner carried whispers. Laura walked in on hushed conversations that stopped the instant she entered. She noticed doors that were locked when they should have been open. Once she woke in the middle of the night and saw a faint light under Emily's door. She paused, listening, and thought she heard Daniel's voice. By the time she pushed the door open, the room was empty, the bed neatly made as if no one had been there at all. The neighbors still admired what they thought was a picture-perfect family. They waved at Daniel mowing the lawn, complimented Laura on her hospitality, and joked about how nice it must be to have Emily around. Laura smiled and nodded, keeping her unease tucked neatly behind polite expressions. She convinced herself she was overreacting. After all, families go through hard times, people change, and stress makes everyone act strangely. Yet each night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, a knot tightening in her chest, knowing something was unraveling. It was a photograph that once again unsettled her. She had set Daniel's phone aside after finding the earlier image of Emily. But when a message popped up one afternoon, curiosity overtook her. The photo attached wasn't explicit, but it was intimate. Emily's hand holding a coffee mug with Daniel's initials, her nails painted bright red, resting on the kitchen counter Laura wiped clean every day. It could have been innocent, but the way it was framed, the way it seemed meant for him, made Laura's stomach turn. She deleted the picture from her mind as quickly as she had seen it, forcing herself to believe it was nothing. Her days became heavier, filled with small doubts that pressed on her from all directions. She stopped inviting colleagues over for dinner, afraid they would sense the tension in her home. She stopped asking Emily about her plans, afraid of what the answers might reveal. Even simple conversations with Daniel felt scripted, with pauses long enough to remind her how far apart they were drifting. Yet despite all these signs, Laura held on to hope. She told herself families bend without breaking, that her marriage was built on years of loyalty, and that her sister would never betray her. She imagined that once Emily found her own place, once Daniel's workload eased, everything would return to normal. She clung to the illusion because the alternative was too unthinkable. But the truth was building silently, like a storm behind closed shutters. Each unexplained charge, each locked door, each whispered word was a warning. Laura refused to hear. She didn't know it yet, but her home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a house filled with secrets, and those secrets were waiting for the right moment to tear everything apart. The morning began like any other, with sunlight spilling through the blinds and the quiet hum of a kettle on the stove. Laura was preparing for work when she heard the sound of something crashing in the kitchen. Rushing in, she found Emily slumped against the counter, pale and trembling, a glass shattered at her feet. Panic surged through Laura as she caught her sister just before she collapsed. Without hesitation, she called for help and drove her to the hospital, her heart pounding with dread. The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air as Laura sat in the waiting room, hands clenched tightly together. She replayed the fall in her mind, convinced something serious was wrong. When the doctor finally appeared, His words landed like a blow she hadn't anticipated. Emily wasn't sick or injured. She was pregnant. For a moment, Laura couldn't speak. Her mind reeled, struggling to match the announcement with the sister she thought she knew. Emily had never mentioned a relationship, never brought anyone home, never given any hint that such a possibility existed. Laura searched for an explanation, clinging to the hope that Emily would reveal the father's name and ease the confusion. But Emily's face crumpled, and instead of answers, she begged Laura not to press her. She refused to say anything, her silence as heavy as a confession. Driving home from the hospital, Laura's mind spun with questions. She tried to imagine a hidden boyfriend, someone Emily had been seeing secretly. Perhaps embarrassment kept her quiet. Perhaps she feared judgment. Laura wanted to be supportive, to protect her sister during what was clearly a fragile time. She promised herself she would wait until Emily was ready to share the truth. But Daniel's reaction told a different story. When Laura explained what the doctor had said, expecting shock or outrage, Daniel's face drained of color. His hands trembled as he asked rapid questions about Emily's condition. How far along she was, if the baby was healthy, what the doctors had advised. His concern seemed less like that of a brother-in-law and more like someone personally invested. Laura stared at him, waiting for him to explain why he cared so deeply, but instead of words he buried himself in silence, avoiding her eyes. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the house grew unbearable. Emily's belly began to show, and with it her secrecy deepened. She kept to herself, locking her door more often, whispering on the phone late at night. Laura pretended not to hear, though every muffled syllable cut like a blade. She noticed Daniel lingering outside Emily's room longer than necessary, knocking gently before slipping inside. Each time Laura told herself it was to check on her sister, to make sure she was comfortable, but deep down the truth clawed at her. Her suspicions sharpened when she walked past the living room one night and caught a glimpse of Daniel and Emily sitting close together, their heads bent as if sharing something forbidden. They didn't see her at first. When they noticed her, both jumped apart, their faces stiff with guilt. Laura froze, her chest tightening, but she forced a smile and asked no questions. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Evidence collected in fragments, each piece adding weight to the unspoken truth. The missing money, the locked doors, Daniel's strange protectiveness, Emily's refusal to name the father, it all pointed in one direction. Still, Laura resisted the conclusion, because accepting it would mean her entire life had been built on betrayal. She clung to denial, telling herself she had misunderstood, that her exhaustion was clouding her judgment. One evening, she found herself standing in front of Emily's closed door, her hand hovering just above the knob. She considered knocking, demanding answers, tearing away the silence once and for all. But fear held her back, fear that the truth would confirm what she already knew in her heart. She retreated to her bedroom instead, lying awake as muffled whispers echoed down the hall. The day Laura noticed the bank transfer was the day denial began to crumble. She opened the joint account to pay a bill and saw a large sum missing. The name on the transfer led to a newly opened account in Emily's name. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. It wasn't only secrecy, it was financial betrayal too. And Daniel was the one making the deposits. Laura's world was no longer one of doubt. It was one of realization. Emily's pregnancy was no mystery. The man she loved, the man she trusted with her life, was the father. Her sister was carrying her husband's child. Yet even as the truth screamed at her, Laura couldn't bring herself to act. She told no one. She didn't confront them. Instead, she walked through the house as if it were haunted, each step weighted with knowledge too heavy to speak aloud. By then it was too late. The betrayal had already taken root, growing in silence, waiting for the moment it would destroy what little remained of the family she once thought unshakable. The weeks that followed became a slow unraveling, a painful confirmation of what Laura had tried so hard not to see. The house that once felt like a place of comfort now carried an unbearable weight. Every room seemed stained with secrets, every silence filled with truths that pressed against her chest. The distance between her and Daniel grew into a canyon. He no longer even pretended to be the husband she had once known. Instead, his attention drifted elsewhere, his energy consumed by the life Emily carried inside her. Laura began to notice patterns that left her cold. Daniel would disappear for hours, claiming errands or late meetings. But she discovered receipts for baby clothes tucked inside his jacket pocket. When Emily moved into a small apartment across town under the guise of wanting independence, Laura should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the full sting of betrayal. Daniel visited often, inventing excuses to be away from home, and Laura didn't need to follow him to know where he went. The smell of baby lotion on his hands and the faint powdery scent on his clothes told her everything she needed to know. Her suspicions turned into certainty when she opened the mailbox one afternoon and found an envelope addressed to Daniel. Inside was a sonogram photo, the black and white image of a child not yet born. Written in Emily's handwriting across the top was the phrase, "Can't wait for you to meet him." Laura's knees buckled as she clutched the picture, her vision blurring. There was no more space for denial. The family she had believed in no longer existed. The betrayal carved into her with every passing day. Emily, once her closest confidant, had become a stranger. Laura remembered childhood memories of shared secrets, laughter under blankets, whispered promises to always protect one another. Those memories now burned like cruel jokes. Her sister had not only broken her trust, but stolen the one person Laura thought she could count on for life. The sting of that realization was deeper than anything she had imagined. Daniel, for his part, made little effort to hide his involvement anymore. Laura caught him transferring large sums of money to Emily's account. He claimed it was a loan to help her stand on her own. But the frequency and size of the deposits made it clear he was funding much more. He avoided her eyes, avoided her touch, and avoided any conversation that might force the truth into the open. Laura stopped asking. The silence between them became its own confession. Nights were the worst. Laura lay awake listening to the emptiness beside her in bed, the hollow space where Daniel used to rest his hand in hers. She thought of Emily sleeping across town, heavy with the child that should have been hers and Daniel's. She thought of the future that had been stolen, the family she had imagined, replaced by something twisted and cruel. Every heartbeat echoed the truth she could no longer escape. Her husband had chosen her sister. When the baby was born, the final piece of proof arrived in the most brutal way possible. Laura came home to find a letter left on the kitchen table. It was official documentation, a birth certificate. The baby boy's name was printed neatly in ink, and beneath it Daniel's name appeared in the space reserved for father. Laura's hands trembled as she held the paper, her tears staining the words. There was no hiding anymore, no excuse or explanation that could undo the reality in front of her. The betrayal was permanent now, not only in memory but in records that could never be erased. Daniel's choice had been carved into law, his name tied to Emily's child for life. Laura stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the certificate, the walls closing in around her. The home she had built was gone, the life she had believed in reduced to lies and signatures. By the time she considered leaving, she knew it was too late to salvage anything. The damage had been done. Emily had her child. Daniel had bound himself to her through fatherhood, and Laura was left with ashes where her marriage once stood. She moved through the days in a fog, her body present but her spirit broken, every corner of the house reminding her of the betrayal that had unfolded under her roof. What made it most unbearable was knowing she had been there the whole time, watching the pieces fall into place, ignoring her instincts because she had wanted so badly to believe in love and loyalty. The truth had been whispering to her for months, and when she finally listened, it was already too late. The life she thought she knew had ended, and nothing could bring it back. The divorce papers were the final act in a tragedy Laura never could have imagined for herself. She signed them with hands that shook, not from hesitation but from exhaustion. Her lawyer explained the terms in a voice that sounded distant, like static in the background. Half the assets, the house sold, accounts split. On paper it seemed fair. In reality, no division of property could measure the depth of what she had lost. Trust wasn't something you could list on a balance sheet, and neither was the bond of sisterhood. Those were gone forever. When the documents were filed, neighbors began to whisper. Some had noticed Daniel's absences. Others had seen Emily's growing belly months before the truth became public. But gossip didn't soften the blow. If anything, it deepened Laura's shame. She hated the thought of being pitied, of people pointing at her life and calling it a scandal. She avoided social gatherings, refused invitations, and built walls around herself. The world outside was too sharp, and she no longer had the strength to endure its edges. Daniel moved in with Emily soon after, though their life together was far from the picture of happiness they had imagined. Laura heard through quiet channels that their relationship was rocky, filled with arguments about money and responsibility. What had once seemed thrilling for them became a burden when faced with the cries of an infant and the relentless weight of real life. Still, they clung to each other, bound by the child they had brought into the world, while Laura was left to rebuild from nothing. For Laura, healing was slow. She packed her belongings into boxes, each one carrying memories she no longer wanted to hold. The wedding photo she once displayed proudly now lay hidden at the bottom of a drawer, too painful to throw away, but unbearable to look at. The little routines that had once defined her life, Sunday mornings with coffee and Daniel reading the paper, evenings spent grading papers with Emily humming in the kitchen, were now just ghosts. She moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, a place where no one knew her story, where she could breathe without feeling the sting of familiarity. Nights were hardest. Alone in her new home, she often replayed the chain of events, searching for the exact moment when everything went wrong. Was it when she first invited Emily to stay? Was it the moment she ignored the sweater on the couch or the blurred photograph on Daniel's phone? Or had the betrayal been building long before she had even noticed? These questions circled endlessly, without answers, leaving her trapped between anger and sorrow. Despite everything, part of her still longed for the family she had lost. She thought about the baby boy, her nephew, and the cruel twist of fate that made him her husband's son. She wondered if he would grow up knowing the truth. If one day he would look at her with eyes that carried both her sister's face and Daniel's blood. The thought both devastated and haunted her. She felt torn between hatred and a deep aching grief for a child who had no part in the choices that destroyed her life. Months passed, and slowly Laura began to reclaim herself. She poured her energy into teaching, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of her classroom. Her students, unaware of the storm she had weathered, looked at her with admiration, and in their eyes she found pieces of her confidence returning. She started attending therapy, where she spoke the words she had held back for so long, unraveling the knots of betrayal in a space where she was finally heard. But the scars remained. Every reminder of Daniel and Emily reopened wounds that never fully closed. Birthdays, holidays, even random encounters in the grocery store left her reeling. They were building a life together, messy and unstable, while she carried the weight of what they had stolen. It wasn't just a marriage or a sister she had lost. It was the belief that love and family were unshakable. The story became something people repeated behind closed doors, a tale of betrayal that felt almost too shocking to be real. For Laura, it was her everyday reality, a life she had to wake up to and survive. She didn't want to be defined by it, but she knew she would never escape its shadow entirely. In the end, Laura learned that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies or strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people you welcome into your home, the ones you trust most, the ones you would never suspect. And when it is, the devastation isn't loud or dramatic. It is quiet, steady, and permanent, seeping into every corner of your life until you are forced to start over. She started over not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Her story was no longer one of a perfect marriage or a close-knit family. It was a story of survival, of learning to live with a wound that would never fully heal, and of finding the strength to walk forward even when the past refused to let go.